video mode I switched off. Audio mode I have to switch off after talking to you.
Okay. So shall
Okay.
I start, Hari?
Yes, Anand. I, I'm eagerly waiting.
Uh, Good afternoon to all. It's again a great pleasure to be a part of this webinar. This is a great development that has taken place during the course of last 3 or 4 weeks, and I have to personally thank Hari and Aditya for taking the initiative and informing this to all those who are interested. The fact that 200 people are willing to hear about appreciation of evidence at 3 o'clock in the afternoon itself shows that there is a lot of interest that is now evinced by all the advocates. My dear friends, please appreciate the fact that a High Court judge, namely Justice Vaidyanathan, who is a senior judge, he comes and attends a webinar of this nature. So therefore, he again reminds to all of us that whatever be our status, whether we are advocates, we are judges, we are always students of law. So I particularly see Mr. Justice Vaidyanathan's presence in this webinar, which gives that very positive indication. And therefore, I am very happy to be presenting one more episode on this appreciation of evidence. Basically, before going into the topic, I would want all of you to basically understand as to what does the law of evidence determine. Let us start from fundamentals. As I always insist that it is always better for us to keep ourselves empty and start it from the fundamentals. Only then it will be more effective. So I expect all of you to have a state of mind like that. So what does law of evidence determine? That's the first question we must be answering before we venture any further into this topic. See, law of evidence determines 4 things. The first that is determined by the law of evidence is what are the facts that needs to be proved in order to establish the subject matter that has to be determined. In other words, the substantive law that is involved in a particular case. Let me give an example. A case involving suit for recovery of money. So, what are the facts that needs to be proved in a case of that nature? If it's a recovery of money based on a promissory note, then there has to be an offer and acceptance between the parties, meaning there must be a contract between the parties. One of the parties must have lent money, the other party must have received the money, and the party who receives the money executes a promissory note, promising that the money will be settled on demand if it is an interest with an interest of so and so. So therefore, that is the fact that requires to be proved in this case where the plaintiff is seeking to recover money based on a promissory note. What happens in a suit for injunction? In a suit for injunction, what are the facts that require to be proved? In a suit for injunction, the plaintiff must establish his right over the property. The plaintiff must establish that he is in possession of the property. The plaintiff must complain that the defendant is attempting to illegally interfere into the possession of the property. So fundamentally, basically, I'm talking about very basics. So fundamentally, these are things which are expected in a suit for injunction. What happens in a suit for declaration? the plaintiff has to derive his title. He has to basically say how he has a title to the property, through what documents he is deriving it, and what is that the defendant is doing in order to create a cloud on the title of the plaintiff. Basically, these are all the requirements in the declaration. So, if one were to properly understand the facts that are to be presented, as I started saying, it involves the substantive law. So, if you are to do all this, you must know the Contract Act, you must know the Transfer of Property Act, you must know the Specific Reliefs Act. So, only if you know these substantive laws, you will be first able to make a foundation for your case. It is only later that the procedural law, Evidence Act, etc. starts coming. So, the law of evidence determination was what the law of evidence determined. The first portion of it, or the first phase of it, is that substantive law. Likewise, take in a criminal law, in a case of murder. In a case of murder, the prosecution has to establish any of the 4 limbs in section 300. That is the fundamental in a murder case. In a case of, say, criminal breach of trust, in a case of criminal breach of trust, what does 405 say? There must be an entrustment. The dominion over the property has been entrusted to the accused person, and the accused person has dishonestly misappropriated the property. So, these are all things which involves the substantive law. So, unless and otherwise you are good in substantive law, there is no question of moving further into the other procedural laws and Evidence Act. So, the first step is the substantive law. So, what are the facts that are required to be proved in order to establish the subject that requires to be determined? The subject that requires to be determined is this substantive law. Okay. Then we go to the next step. The next step is what proof is to be given of those facts. So, in order to establish all these things, what proof has to be given for establishing those facts? It will be oral, it will be documentary, it will be material objects in a criminal case. So, these are the proof that has to be given for the purpose of establishing the facts. This is step number 2. Third, who has to give it? Who has to give this proof is the next question. Who has to give depends upon the person, who has to give the proof. The straightforward answer that is found is in 101 of the Evidence Act, which speaks about burden of proof and onus of proof. That one provision talks about 2 different things. Burden of proof is the proof that requires to be established by the person who is approaching the court, seeking for a relief. And it is that person, it is also called as legal burden. It is that person who has to give it, who has to give the evidence, who has to establish, who has to prove it. And what is onus of proof? Onus of proof is the particular defense or particular stand that is taken by either of the parties, which is relied upon by them, which they have to prove for themselves. For instance, the defendant takes the stand that the agreement was taken from him by coercion fraud. If he takes a stand to that effect, then the onus of proof will be upon him to show as to how he is going to substantiate his defense that the agreement was plucked away from him by coercion, fraud, etc. So, the third step is who is to give it? Who has to give it? Likewise, when it comes to the relevant facts, the other evidences that are being relied upon, then it will depend upon the witness who is being examined for that purpose, for establishing the relevant facts, which ultimately go to prove the fact issue. So that is the third step. The last is how it must be given. How it must be given. So these are broadly the 4 things which are determined when evidence is given before the court. So therefore, One is what facts needs to be proved in order to establish that which is the subject matter of determination. What proof is to be given of those facts? 3, who has to give it? 4, how it should be given. These are the fundamentals. Then, what are the provisions contained under the Evidence Act? What provisions are there under the Evidence Act? There are broadly 3 heads under which you can bring the Evidence Act. We regularly say this in the court, and without realizing that what we are saying is directly traceable to that. The first thing which an Evidence Act contains is relevancy of facts, which we call in court as relevant facts, relevancy. Then what does the Evidence Act have? It talks about the proof of facts. Then the third thing which is given by the Evidence Act is the production of the proof of the relevant facts, which we regularly call in court as relevancy, proof, and admissibility. Generally, when a petition is filed for additional evidence before the court, we say, my lord, I have no objection in allowing the application, but it must be subject to relevancy, proof, and admissibility. Don't we all say that in the court? That is what is ultimately given under the Evidence Act. That relevancy, proof, and admissibility is the one which is broadly dealt with under the Evidence Act. Now, having known that, we will go into the next step. What is the next step? I was continuously saying right from the beginning the word fact, fact, fact. So we must first understand what is meant by a fact. What is meant by a fact? It is important to understand what a fact is. The definition is provided under the Evidence Act under Section 3. See, Section 3 says that a fact means and includes 1. Anything, state of things, or relation of things capable of being perceived by the senses. 2. Any mental condition of which any person is conscious. These are the 2 things that are coming. One is all the things or state of things or relation to things which can be perceived by the senses. If you look at the illustration, it says that there are certain objects arranged in a certain order in a place is a fact. A man heard something is a fact. The man saw something is a fact. The man had uttered certain things is a fact. So basically, whatever these 5 senses are able to perceive and which is able to be spoken about are all facts. And the additional thing that has been added to the definition is mental condition of which any person is conscious. So the mind, how it understands a particular situation, is also covered under the definition of fact. So the fact involves whatever is perceived by all the 5 senses and the mental condition. So in whole, this is what is called as a fact. So whatever is said through those perseverance, through perceiving out of those 5 senses, and whatever is said by the mind, understanding it and delivering it, all these things come under the definition of a fact. So next thing which we have to understand is fact in issue. Fact in issue is also defined under the Evidence Act under Section 3. I don't want to read the definition. Let me straight away tell you. Fact in issue is one which is directly in contention between the parties. Fact in issue is the one which is directly in contention between the parties. We are in an adversarial system. What does the adversarial system do? In an adversarial system, one person comes to the court seeking for some relief, the other person defends it or objects to it, and then the judge decides the case. So in an adversarial system, there are 2 parties who are involved. So in a fact in issue, what happens? One that is in contention between the parties is normally called as the fact in issue. For instance, a fact in issue can be understood in a civil law under Order 14 of CPC, which talks about the framing of issues. So when does the issue come? The issue comes after the plaint is filed, the written statement is filed, the pleadings are completed, and what is actually the claim, what is actually the defense, and what is that has to be decided by the court is the one which is delineated by way of issues under Order 4. So that's a fact in issue. What happens in a criminal case? In a criminal case, after the investigation, a final report is filed under Section 173 of CRPC. After the final report is filed before the court, depending upon the nature of trial, whether it is a sessions trial or a warrant trial, etc., under Section 228, 240, 246, frames charges. It frames charges based on the materials that have been collected by the investigation in the course of investigation, and that has been placed before the court in the name of a final report under Section 173, out of which the charges. This is called as a fact in issue insofar as a criminal case is concerned. So basically, you will have to understand fact in issue this way. Then the next term which you must understand is the relevant fact. So next you have to understand what a relevant fact is. The relevant fact is also defined under Section 3 of the Act, and it basically says these are the facts which go to prove or disprove the facts in issue. So what are relevant facts? The relevant facts are those facts which are established before the court, which are admitted by the court in order to come to a fair conclusion with regard to the fact in issue that is before the court. So in short, you have to understand the term relevant act as the facts which go to prove or disprove the facts in issue. That is how you have to understand a relevant fact. Now, after having understood these terms, you will hereafter you will understand as to why I was going into the fundamental things like the fact in issue, relevant fact, etc. Only if you understand this properly, you will be able to understand properly the terminologies that are used under Section 5 and thereafter. Only then you will understand why it is placed that way. So, Section 5 of the Evidence Act is very important. You have to read it and reread it again and again, because for every trial lawyer, your success before the trial court will depend upon how thorough you are with the Evidence Act. If you are thorough with the Evidence Act, I am assuring you, my dear friends, that you will be a very, very successful trial lawyer. If you are not well versed with the Evidence Act, then you are as bad as the client who is there before the court. So therefore, it's very important for a lawyer who is practicing trial before the subordinate courts to be very well versed with this, and that is why it is important to read and reread as and when you get time. So Section 5 of the Evidence Act says evidence may be given in any suit or proceedings of the existence or non-existence of every fact, underline the word fact, existence or non-existence of every fact in issue, and of such other facts as are hereinafter declared to be relevant. So what are the such other facts which have been hereinafter declared to be relevant? Those are the ones which are covered under Section 6 to Section 55 of the Evidence Act. Those are all called as relevant facts. And the last word is the one which you have to keep underlining. and no others. And no others. So, the section 5 makes it abundantly clear that evidence can be given before the court only with regard to fact in issue and relevant fact under section 6 to 55 and no others. The language is very clear, and therefore whatever you bring before a court will have to either pertain to the fact in issue or it must pertain to the relevant facts. So that is the evidence that these only insofar as these two things are concerned, evidence can be given. Then you must understand that section 136 of the Evidence Act makes it very, very clear that it is the court which is the final authority to decide regarding admissibility of an evidence. It is given to the complete discretion of the court, of course, based on the provisions of the Act, and therefore it is the court which determines under 136 of the Evidence Act and which is the final authority to decide the admissibility of evidence. Basically, the admissibility of evidence as a general rule will directly relate to the relevancy. In other words, relevancy is the best test of admissibility. So, whatever is stated to be relevant from section 6 to section 55 as a general rule is the one which is admissible in evidence. So that is the general rule with regard to the admissibility. Whatever is stated to be relevant under these provisions are admissible. Then, see these relevant facts, that is the general rule. Then I'll develop it from there. The relevant facts need not always be admissible. The other way around is not always correct. So don't think that whatever is relevant at any given point of time is admissible also. That's not what it says. It is a threshold stage. So sometimes law itself will bar its admissibility. Law itself will bar it. For instance, there is a privileged communication as between the advocate and client, husband, wife, etc. See, whatever is covered under, I will not go into it, whatever is covered under 122 to 131 of the Evidence Act, these are all privileged communications and these are all privileged witnesses. It covers privileged witnesses and privileged communications. So, per se, those types of communications are those which are stated by those privileged witnesses can be brought under the relevant facts, from section 6 to section 55. But it is barred by section 122 to 131. So therefore, even if these facts are relevant, if it comes within the purview of 122 to 131, then it will not become admissible. That's what I said. So it may be relevant, but the law itself has barred it, saying that it is not admissible. Then I will give you another example. For instance, a person goes before the police and he confesses something to the police. Per se, what he has confessed to the police may be treated as an admission, or it can be literally brought in as an admission under the Evidence Act. If it is brought as an admission, it will be a relevant fact. But section 25 of the Evidence Act completely bars any confession made to the police officer. So that means that even though it may be relevant under the general term of admission, it is barred by section 25. Therefore, even though it is a relevant fact, it is not admissible in view of the bar under law. So this is another example which I can give. Then, same way, relevancy and proof or the mode of proof are also two different things. Please understand, relevancy and the mode of proof are two different things. So I have covered relevancy and admissibility. Then I'm going into the mode of proof. So this relevancy and the mode of proof are also completely two different aspects altogether. I will give you an example. See, now a suit is filed for recovery of money based on a promissory note. The promissory note is sought to be, the copy of the promissory note is sought to be marked before the court. The promissory note is a relevant fact, and the fact in issue to be decided in the case is whether the defendant had borrowed money from the plaintiff by executing this promissory note. What is now sought to be marked before the court is the copy of the promissory note. Now, Section 64 of the Evidence Act basically says that the document that is produced before the court must be primary, meaning it must be original. That is the fundamental rule. Now, so it is a relevant fact that copy is sought to be brought before the court. The mode of proof is by trying to mark a copy of the promissory note. It is stopped by the court. It is objected by the other side, saying that he cannot mark a copy of the promissory note, and he has to bring the primary evidence. The very document itself has to be marked before the court. So that objection is, so even though it is relevant, burden of when the mode of proving that document becomes a problem, so court will say, no, I will not allow you to mark this document. Then what will you tell the court? No, I will be able to establish that I can mark the secondary evidence in this case under Section 65. 65 gives the list of conditions where you are permitted to let in secondary evidence. So therefore, you can always say that it comes within that the provisions of Section 65. You can say that the original promissory note was signed and it was given to the defendant since he wanted to keep it in his custody. I have given a notice to the defendant to produce the promissory note. In spite of receiving that notice, the defendant has refused to give the original promissory note. Therefore, under Section 65A, I am entitled to file or mark a copy of the. So once you establish that fact, then what happens? Then it is the relevant fact, and the court also admits that document because the mode of proof has satisfied the requirement of Section 65. So therefore, relevancy and the mode of proof are again two different aspects. A document which is relevant may not be admissible when there is a problem with regard to the mode of proof. I'll give you another example. For instance, phone calls are made between the accused persons before the murder takes place. So these phone calls through their mobile numbers is now sought to be brought before the court by the prosecution in order to establish the fact that there was a clear meeting of minds between the parties. There was a conspiracy between the parties before the incident took place. So they take it from the service provider and it is sought to be marked. It is a relevant fact, but when it is sought to be marked, the court says, or the other side, the counsel for the accused objects saying, no, this cannot be marked because he is bound to get a certificate under Section 65 B4. Without that certificate, this document cannot be marked. So even though the phone calls that happened between the parties may be a relevant fact, the mode of proof, namely the marking of the telephone calls as between the parties from the service provider, is stopped in view of the mandatory requirement under Section 65B4, which says that you will have to mark it along with the certificate given by the service provider. You understand? So therefore, this is what is This is the difference between the, so whatever is relevant need not automatically get itself proved, need not automatically get itself admissible. So these three are three different things. What are those three? Relevancy, admissibility, and proof. These three are relevant. Okay. Now I'm going to get into, after all, laying all these fundamentals, now I'm slowly getting into the topic that has been assigned to me, which is appreciation of evidence. See, whenever I deal with this subject, if I start talking theory to you, you first of all, it will be very boring, and you may not really appreciate or understand how this really works. So therefore, I always would want to do it by way of giving an illustrative case and then explaining the law behind it, and thereafter make you understand as to the importance of the appreciation of evidence. What are the various steps that are involved in the appreciation of evidence? See, imagine that there is a trial court with 50 small doors. Small doors, like pigeonholes, 50 small doors. These 50 independent small pigeonholes are representing section 6 to section 55. Each pigeonhole is representing one section starting from section 6 to section 55. So the facts that are to be admitted by the court are waiting outside these pigeonholes. They are all waiting outside. Court is here, pigeonholes are here. It is all waiting outside. These facts which are required to be admitted by the court. So when a party wants to bring in those facts and make it admissible before the court, then he must satisfy any of the requirements under section 6 to section 55. That is what I said under section 5. So each pigeonhole, he has, when he wants a fact to be brought in as relevant and admissible, then he must be able to trace it to any of those provisions under section 6 to section 55. If he is able to trace it, then based on the provision which he is able to trace, that pigeonhole will open and the relevant fact will get into the court. So you imagine this so that it will be very easy for you to understand how this works. That's why I'm giving you a sort of a figurative model for this. Then the first step, so there is a court, counsel, everybody is here, and there are 50 small pigeonholes. The relevant facts are all waiting outside. It's all waiting outside. Now, the first step of appreciation of evidence is admissibility. Admissibility is the first step that has to take place in the process of appreciation of evidence. Now, I will give you the illustration. Carefully listen to this illustration, and with this illustration, I will explain you the various steps in the appreciation of evidence. It will be more easier for you to understand. Okay. The illustration is this. The illustration is A is a distant relative of B. So there is a property dispute between both of them, and there are simmering differences between the parties. So B decides to kill A. B decides to kill A. So B enters into a conspiracy with C, D, and E. He enters into a conspiracy with C, D, and E. And they constantly meet and are making plans, are trying to evolve a plan in order to carry out this murder. Then they make frequent phone calls between them. B makes phone calls to CDE, and CDE in the same way makes phone calls. CDE among themselves make phone calls. So these phone calls are happening between them. and the conspiracy is slowly growing. They are trying to evolve a plot, basically. Then what happens is that B purchases a second-hand car. He purchases a second-hand car in the meantime. He also does it. Then what happens is, on a particular day, he makes a phone call. He makes a phone call to A. And he tells him that why are we continuously fighting like this? Enough is enough. After all, we are relatives. So therefore, why don't we both talk and settle the matter among ourselves so that both of us can live a peaceful life and our families will not unnecessarily get alienated. So therefore, why don't we discuss? So that's a phone call that is made by B to A. So he tells A that he can meet him in a restaurant on, say, 1/4/2020. Since it's an illustration, I'm just giving a date. So we'll meet on 1/4/2020 at a particular restaurant, Saravana Bhavan restaurant, some restaurant. Restaurant we'll meet. And he says that we'll meet around 7:30 p.m. Let us meet there around 7:30 p.m. After getting this phone call, A becomes happy. He thinks that at the end of the day, it's good that the issue is getting resolved. Therefore, he gets very happy. So what he does is, he informs his friend, a very close friend of his, about this development. He says that that friend will name him as X. So he informs X that on so and so date we'll go. He has called me for a dinner in a restaurant. We'll go there. We'll have food and we will talk and I'll try to resolve the issue. So what happens is that in the meantime, B calls C, D, and E. After this phone call, B calls C, D, and E and informs them about this development. And he asks them to wait in a particular spot on that day. That is on 1/4/2020. You please wait on that particular spot. So and so spot you wait. So on the fateful day, A along with his friend X comes and arrives in the restaurant in a call taxi. So they take a call taxi, they come to the restaurant, they reach that place at about 7:30 p.m. So 7:30 p.m. they reach that place. So immediately B shakes hands with them. He talks pleasantly with them. They have dinner in that restaurant. Basically, he tries to talk with him as to how this can be resolved, so on, etc., etc. So this conversation takes place. So this dinner is over. 9 o'clock, it is all over. So 9 o'clock, B makes an offer to A and X, saying that he will drop them in the car. Why should they again take some call taxi? I will drop you in the car. Why don't you come? And he said, anyway, I have a car and I can drop you and then I can go home. So both of them bona fide believed what he was saying. So they got into the car. He drives the car. The car goes to that particular spot where B had asked C, D, and E to wait. All of a sudden, the car stops. So B gets down from the car saying that there is some problem in the car, and he goes and he opens the bonnet, opens it. In the meantime, A and X come out of the car just to see what the problem is. Then they find that C, D, and E, one of them having a knife and two of them having sickles, are ominously running towards them. Immediately after seeing them running towards them, A and X start running. They start running from the place. They get into the next street. There were some passers-by who were shocked with the incident, And within a few minutes, C, D, and E closed down. They start attacking A. They start attacking A. X, as a friend, tries to intervene. He is also attacked. So what happens is that A suffers grievous injuries. X also suffers injuries. The passerby who sees this incident shouts. They shout, saying that Utita, Vetita, he is cutting him, he is stabbing him, they are being killed. So these are sounds that are raised by the one or two passers-by who see this incident. Immediately C, D, and E run away from that place. They go to the place where A was, B was waiting, and B takes them in his car. So C, D, and E fled away from the scene of occurrence, go to the place where A was waiting, get into the car, they leave. Then what happens is that someone informs the emergency ambulance. Ambulance comes to the place. So A and X are taken from the scene of occurrence in the ambulance to a hospital, and the hospital informs the police about this incident. The police comes to the hospital. They take the statement of X, and an FIR gets registered. And what happens is that after 2-3 days, A dies, X survives, and after some time he is also discharged. In the course of investigation, B, C, D, and E are arrested by the police, and a final report comes to be filed before the concerned court for offence under 120B, Red with 300, the Red with 302, 302 simpliciter, 307, 506 part 2, etc. So charge sheet is filed. I hope that you have carefully listened to the facts of the case, because if you had carefully listened, then what I am going to say on appreciation of evidence will become more easier for you. So this happens, final report filed, charges framed on this, all these provisions, trial starts. No, the prosecution, the evidence that is relied upon the prosecution is all waiting, as I told you, behind those 50 doors, 50 pigeon poles. It is all waiting. Now, a witness is brought into the court and he is examined. In the course of examination, this witness says that on that day, I had gone to the grocery shop and I was returning back home, at which point of time, at about 10:15 p.m., at about 10 or 10:15 p.m., I heard people shouting from the nearby place that somebody is being stabbed, somebody is being cut, somebody is being brutally attacked. I heard all these sounds. So this is sought to be brought in as an evidence by the prosecution. The other side, the defense counsel, stands up and he says, no. How can you admit this evidence? This is only a hearsay evidence. This man has not seen it. And what he says is about somebody else uttering about the incident. So therefore, no, this is not relevant. You cannot admit it. Then the prosecutor gets up and he says that this is relevant under section 6 of the Act, which all of you will know, which is legally called as res gestae. So things that are heard, said spontaneously, simultaneously when the incident happens. If you read 6, you will find that language which will talk about it. So I don't want to really read every provision. I will only tell you the provision. You just go through the provision, or else I will not be able to complete the lecture. So the prosecutor says that no, this is a relevant fact and it forms part of the same transaction, and this is something which was so connected with the incident that took place. So what happens is that the court also sees that this is something which was which is coming squarely under section 6. So this pigeonhole under section 6 opens and this evidence gets admitted. It gets admitted. It's a relevant fact. Then what happens? Then Mahazar witnesses are examined before the court. What are these Mahazar witnesses saying? These Mahazar witnesses are saying that we were going through that place and the police inspector called us and he asked us to stand as a witness for recovering things which were found in the place where the incident took place. So, what is sought to be marked? What is sought to be brought in? A rough sketch, a seizure Mahazar, whatever was seized, which the material objects that were contained in the scene of occurrence. What was there? There was a blood-soaked sand that was available. There was some stones that were available. There was a chapel that was worn by the deceased that was available. So all this is seized from the spot and they stand as a witness. When this is done, the defense rises up and says, no, how is it, how can it be admitted? Then the prosecutor stands up and says, please look at section 7 of the Evidence Act. Section 7 of the Evidence Act basically says the cause and effect of anything which had happened in the place. See, this blood, this chapel, this change in the entire spectrum of that place, the changes that had happened in the scene of occurrence could not have happened if this incident had not happened. So therefore, section 7 covers this. It covers this. So immediately after that, the court is convinced, pigeonhole for section 7 opens, it is admitted by the court. Then witnesses are examined who speak about the previous enmity between A and B with regard to that property dispute about which I was talking. Other side says, no, you cannot do it. Then the prosecution says that this is motive for the entire incident and it is a relevant fact under section 8 of the Evidence Act. So pigeonhole for section 8 opens, it comes in. Then what happens is that another witness is examined by the prosecution who speaks about seeing the accused persons coming near a pump set and washing their blood-soaked dress, washing their hands, washing their blood from them. He had seen them as he was passing by. This witness speaks about it. Then this is objected. I am on the threshold. Please don't immediately take your mind to how it can be believed and all that. I'll come to that. I'm only on the first step. So this is objected. Then the prosecutor says, this is on the conduct of the accused persons immediately after the incident. This is what this witness has seen. So that is also covered under section 8. It becomes admissible and relevant. It comes into the court under section 8. Then one more witness is examined by the prosecution who has seen the incident. He is the so-called eyewitness in this case, who has seen this incident, and he is examined by the prosecution as an eyewitness who has witnessed it, and he is also examined by the prosecution insofar as identity of C, D, and E. So this person, this witness, was a witness to the test identification parade that was conducted by the police through the magistrate. Why? Because C, D, and E are persons who are unknown. Since they are persons who are unknown, both X and C, both X and the eyewitness were asked to identify them. So for the test identification parade, C, D, and E were identified, and this is sought to be brought through the witness. This is objected, for which the prosecutor says that it is covered under, such identity is covered under section 9 of the Evidence Act. So it is a relevant fact that pigeonhole opens section, that relevant fact comes in under section 9. Same way, the witness, there are witnesses who are examined by the prosecution who speaks about a particular witness speaks about A, B and X sitting and talking in the restaurant and leaving the restaurant at about 9:30 p.m. So he is a person who was the manager, or who was the in charge of that hotel, or the server in that hotel who had seen them. He is the witness who speaks about it. So, to what extent can his evidence be taken into account? He says that these persons, I saw them having their food and leaving at around 9:30. Incident had taken place, as I said, at about 10 or 10:15. So, in order to fix the time of occurrence, this evidence given by this witness becomes a relevant fact under section 9. So, from the same pigeonhole of section 9, it becomes relevant and admissible. So, it comes. So, this evidence is relied upon. Then what happens? Witnesses are examined who say that D was in his shop. I said C, D and E are the other co-accused, correct? So, D was in his shop and he got a phone call, and he had come to the shop belonging to this witness. He got a phone call when he immediately after the phone call came, he went to the corner of the shop and he started conversing, saying that he will come to a particular place and that everything has been made ready and that somehow it has to be finished, etc. It's a lot of things he had spoken. So, what happens is that this is heard by this particular witness, and he speaks about this. And why is this evidence being brought in by the prosecution? In order to establish that there was a conspiracy. There was a conspiracy between the parties. So, in order to establish that the basic facts for conspiracy, prosecution is relying upon one which is called as the phone call details that had taken place between the accused persons on various days on the date of occurrence, and also the call that was received by D when he was in the shop of this particular witness. Now, this evidence given by this witness will not only bind D, it will bind all the other witnesses. Now, if you carefully look at section 10 of the Evidence Act, section 10 of the Evidence Act deals with conspiracy. This is a very important section, and many lose sight of this section, and we do not really understand the significance of this section. This section is very, very important. I will explain you why it is important. See, if you take section 10, it says, where there is a reasonable ground to believe that two or more persons have conspired. So, basically, there must be reasonable grounds to believe. For the purpose of establishing the reasonable grounds, prosecution is relying upon the phone call that has taken place between the accused persons, and it has got all the details from the service provider along with the certificate given by him. So, there is a ground to believe that they have conspired together to commit an offense or an actionable wrong. Then anything said, done or written, three things: anything said, done or written, சொன்னது, செய்தது, எழுதினது, written, by any one of such person in reference to their common intention. In this case, D was the one about whom that witness was speaking. After the time when such intention was first entertained by one of them, is a relevant fact against whom? Is a relevant fact as against each of the person believed to be conspiring. So this statement which comes out is not only on confined to D. It will be put against B, it will be put against C, it will be put against E also. That is the purpose of this. But it will stop, see again, as well as for the purpose of showing it, this will stop by any is a relevant fact acts against each of the persons believing to be conspiring, as well as for the purpose of proving the existence of a conspiracy, as for the purpose of showing that any such person was a party to it. So this will continue till the act is committed. So this is a sort of confession of a co-accused. See, whenever we speak about confession of a co-accused, there are certain provisions which come to our mind. What are those provisions? Those provisions are section 30, section 133, section 114B. All these things come to our mind. But we leave section 10. Actually, section 10 is even more dangerous because the things that are said, done, or written by any one of such persons in reference to that common intention, then it becomes a relevant fact not only against him, it becomes a relevant fact as against all the others also. That stops immediately after the incident takes place. So whatever happens before that can all be proved under section 10 as a relevant fact, and that is the purpose of this provision. Now, there was a reason why I wanted to spend some time on this. That's why I did it. So therefore the prosecutor says this is relevant under section 10. The door opens, the pigeonhole opens, the evidence comes in. Then what happened was B, who is a Christian, had confided about this incident to a priest belonging to the church where he regularly goes for prayers. So he was not able to really bear it, and he was suffering inside, and he wanted to tell this to somebody. So therefore he goes to the priest. He tells the priest that he has committed this. The priest is now brought before the court as a witness. This we technically always called as extrajudicial confession. Extrajudicial confession. So the priest comes, he speaks in the court about B coming and confiding to him about the entire incident. Now, immediately it is objected. The prosecutor says, if it is not induced by threat, coercion, fraud, etc., which is barred under section 24, it becomes a relevant fact. So therefore, he says that under 24, this is an extrajudicial.
Anand.
Yes.
It's
Yes. Can I continue?
Anand, the audio is not.
My audio is not proper?
No, no, my lord. The audible is fine, my lord. I believe.
Yeah, can I continue?
Audio.
Yeah. So what happens is that he confides. So this evidence of the priest, that pigeonhole for section 24 opens, and that evidence gets into the court. It's a relevant fact. It is not hit, or it is not prevented or stopped from being considered by any of those things which are provided under 24. So that becomes a relevant fact. Then what happens is that after the arrest of B, C, D, and E, they make a confession to the police. So to the investigating officer, a confession is given. The confession has everything into it with regard to the entire incident as to how it all started, how they conspired, how they planned, how he called A to the restaurant, and the entire incident they say. They also say that after the incident, this knife and sickle was concealed in some place, and they have also concealed their blood-stained dress somewhere, and they take the police to the investigating officer to the concerned place, and all this is taken. So what happens? now this is a confession that has been given to the police. So what does section 25 say? Section 25 of the Evidence Act makes it very clear that a confession that is made to a police officer, that no confession made to a police officer shall be proved as against the person accused of any offense. So the defense says, no, this is all, the prosecutor gets up and says that it is relied upon only to the extent of discovery of fact under section 27. Therefore, to that extent, it is relevant and admissible. If you take 27 is an exception to section 25. 27 starts with the word provided that. This is a very peculiar provision where a provision itself starts with the words provided that. It's an exception, provided that when any fact is deposed to as discovered in consequence of information received from a person accused of any offense in the custody of a police officer, so much of such information, underline that, so much of such information, whether it amounts to a confession or not, as relates distinctly to the fact thereby discovered may be proved. So this is an exception under 25. Two words in section 27 is very important. Two words are that one is so much of information, other is which distinctly relates to the fact that has been discovered. So discovery of a fact. If you want to understand the purport of this provision, please read Pulikuri Kotaya case. Pulikuri Kotaya case will give you the entire gamut until today. That is the judgment which is being relied upon. So therefore, the prosecutor says that the material objects, what are the material objects? The knife, the sickle, the blood-stained clothes that were conceived, all that gets in, and this confession and this recovery is made in the presence of witnesses. These witnesses speak about it. The prosecutor says this is a relevant fact under section 27 because the confession, to the extent that it has led to the discovery of all these material objects, is a relevant fact under 27. Therefore, the pigeonhole under section 27 opens, it comes in. It becomes relevant. Then what happens is that E, who is one of the accused persons, he decides to confess to the crime. So therefore, he is taken to the magistrate. The magistrate, after satisfying all the requirements under section 164 of CRPC, records the confession of E. So what happens is that this confession under 164 is also in the nature of a former statement, like 161. 161 is a statement recorded by police. 164 is a statement recorded by the magistrate. Both these are called as former statements only. So this is the nature of a former statement. So now the prosecution is seeking to mark this statement that was recorded from E. This is objected by the other side, saying that you cannot do it. Then the prosecutor gets up and says that section 26 of the Evidence Act permits such a confession where it has been made in the presence of the magistrate. So therefore, this 164 statement that is recorded is marked as a document. So that comes in through the pigeonhole of section 26 of the Evidence Act. Then what happens is that the said confession is also taken to be a confession as against the co-accused. Then the court says, then it is objected saying, no, we let him confine it to him. He need not, his confession will not have any impact. Then the prosecutor says that all these persons are tried together, and therefore it is a confession which is a relevant fact under 30. Therefore, it is a confession which can be relied upon even as against the co-accused. So, to that extent that evidence is also taken, it becomes relevant. Then, the doctor is examined. The doctor to whom A and X were immediately taken after the incident is examined. That doctor talks about the statement that was given to him by the deceased A as to the entire incident. And the doctor talks about the injuries he found in the body of A and the injuries he found in the body of X. This doctor also gives his opinion on the injuries that were found. No, all this is thought to be brought in as evidence. The prosecutor justifies it by relying upon what? By relying upon section 32(1) of the Evidence Act, saying that what was said by A to the doctor is in the nature of a dying declaration. So therefore, it becomes a relevant fact under section 32(1) of the Evidence Act. He also says the opinion that was given by the doctor with regard to the injuries which he had found in the body of A becomes a relevant fact and is admissible under what? Under 45 of the Evidence Act. So these pigeonholes open, all these things gets in. And this doctor is also an eyewitness insofar as the injuries which he directly saw in the body of A and X. To that extent, his evidence is also relevant as an eyewitness to the injuries that were found in the body of A and X. Then postmortem doctor is examined. Postmortem doctor talks about what? He talks about the injuries that were found in the body of the deceased A, and he also gives his opinion with regard to the cause of death. So, how is it relevant? It is relevant under section 45 of the Evidence Act because it's an expert opinion given by this person based on what he found in the body and based on his analysis and assessment as to the cause of death. Cause of death becomes very important in a case of this nature, in a case of murder. So, all these relevant doors are opened and all these things are admitted in evidence. You understand? The reason why I was spending so much of time is to make you understand that this is how the first step happens in the process of appreciation of evidence. So, this is how the court had opened, the pigeonholes are opened and the relevant facts had brought in. And this is just a demonstrative case about which I am saying. So, all these happened. So, the relevant doors opened, all these came to the court. Then, the second step in the appreciation of evidence. What is the second step in the appreciation of evidence? Yes, these relevant facts have got in to the table of the court. Court is now having it. Next to what is the court doing? The court is testing the credibility or the reliability of this evidence that has now come to its table. It is testing the credibility or reliability, which is basically the court is either believing it or not believing it. That's the credibility and reliability. Now, which provision gives the power to court to make, to believe or not to believe? You must understand, you must trace it to some provision under the Evidence Act. We are in the Evidence Act. Please understand why it is important. Why is it important? Because the police who investigated the case did not see the incident. The prosecutor who conducted the case on the side of the state did not see this incident. The counsel who appeared for the accused persons did not see this incident. And the judge who decides this case did not see the incident. 4 persons who had not seen the incidents are involved in deciding as to who has committed this offense and whether it is these accused persons who have committed it. Therefore, it becomes very important to understand what it means for a court to believe. Believe is a very important word because the second step in the process of appreciation of evidence is testing the credibility or the reliability of the evidence that has been admitted into the court being relevant under section 6 to section 55. Then, what happens at this stage? Please see section 3 of the Evidence Act. It is very important. Section 3 of the Evidence Act talks about what it means by proved. What it means by proved. This is where that the belief, the word belief is used under the Evidence Act. See, prove. A fact is said to be proved. A case is said to be proved. A fact is said to be proved. A fact in சொல்லும்போது immediately நான் factனா என்னன்னு முதல்ல சொன்னது ஞாபகம் வரணும் உங்களுக்கு. A fact is said to be proved when, after considering the matters before it, after considering the matters before whom? Before the court. Before it, the court either believes it to exist or it considers its existence so probable that a prudent man, it is not a judge, it is a prudent man ought, under the circumstances of the particular case, to act upon the supposition, it is supposition that it exists. Look at the wordings of this provision. See, basically what comes out of it, the court considers the matters before it. Court considers the matters before it. What are the matters before it? Fact in issue, relevant facts. These are the matters that are before the court. Court has these things before it. Then it relates. Why did these matters come before the court? It came before the court because the court, it relates to the proof of a fact. For proving a particular fact, it came in as a relevant fact. So the second thing is, second pivotal factor is, this matters before the court, considering the matters before it, which relates to the proof of a fact. And after considering it, what does the court do? What is the standard of proof that is given to the court? It is a neutral standard of an ordinary prudent man. James Stephen did not say that the standard of proof is that of a judge. He is not using that word. He is using the word ordinary prudent man. So the standard of proof that is expected to be exercised by the court is the neutral standard of an ordinary prudent man. What he should do? It is either he believes the fact to exist or he considers the existence of the fact so probable, probabilizing. So either he believes the fact to exist or he considers its existence so probable. So the test is belief and probability. And this is the standard of proof on in both the criminal and civil case. It does not differentiate. The definition under the proof does not differentiate between a civil and criminal case. It says that the court will come to a belief based on the matters before it, which it believes to exist, or it considers its existence so probable. So therefore, this is the test for being proved. Now, the word that has been used is existence, believes the fact to exist, considers its existence so probable. What is this? What is it believing? What is the existence about which it is talking about? In order to understand that, you will have to go to section 114 of the Evidence Act. Section 114 of the Evidence Act deals with what can be presumed with regard to existence of certain facts. Belief, existence of facts. These are the words which will have to be hammering your ears now. So belief, probabilizing, we find it under section 3. Then what is this existence of fact about which it is talking about? It is talking about the presumption made by the court on the matters before it. Which provision gives the court to make such a presumption? See, there are three things. The court cannot assume. The court cannot merely presume. But the court is vested with the power of legal presumption. that power of legal presumption is given under section 114 of the Evidence Act. Now you carefully read 114. The court may presume the existence of any fact. You read this word existence of fact where? Under the definition of proved under section 3. May presume the existence of any fact which it thinks likely to have happened, regard being had to the common course of natural events, human conduct, and public and private business in relation to the facts of the particular case. This is the legal presumption that has been allowed to the court. So you have to read 3 and 114, and then you will understand that these are the two provisions which are giving that power to the court to believe or not to believe the facts that are placed before it. So everything has to be traced. Everything has to be traced under the Act. So this is the one which gives the court that belief. See, the Evidence Act itself uses 3 terms: may presume, shall presume, and conclusive proof. When it comes to, again, it is defined under section 4. I don't want to go into it much. I'm only saying that insofar as may presume is concerned, it is having regard to the fact and it is a rebuttable presumption. So this evidence in the first step, which is relevant and which is admitted by the court, and the court is testing its credibility and reliability, and it is convinced about it. It does not stop there because it is under the realm of may presume, because it believes it to be correct, it believes it to be credible. Then it is possible for the other side to rebut it. A rebuttal is permitted as per the definition of may. Disproved is the word used. I am saying rebuttal. Then what is shall presume? Shall presume is where the court is mandatorily to presume it. It is mandate for the court to presume it, and this word is used in many of the provisions. And it shall presume means it is mandatory for the court to presume, like the word which we find under 139 of the Negotiable Instruments Act, where it says that the court shall presume that there was a debt or liability. So you all know that. I don't want to go into it. So this is the shall presume. What happens in a shall presume is that no option is given to the court to either believe or disbelieve it, but the other side is entitled to rebut it. The person against whom it is going put is entitled to rebut it. This is the difference between may presume and shall presume. What is the third one about which I said? Conclusive proof. Conclusive proof is a presumption of law. Law itself says that it is a conclusive proof, and it is mandatory, and it is irrebuttable. It cannot be rebutted. It cannot be allowed to be rebutted. You can find this under section 112 of the Evidence Act. See, under 112 of the Evidence Act, in fact, in a given case, you can find all the 3 things in a given case. For instance, the long cohabitation between a man and woman. Court may presume that there was a marriage. Long cohabitation between a man and woman, court may presume that they are married. Then there is an access between the two, and there was intercourse. This is the court shall presume, since they had access to it. This is a natural conduct. So therefore, it will come under shall presume. Then a child is born out of it. Then conclusive proof comes. So I don't want to digress too much. I'm only saying that all the 3 will come under a given case. So going back to what I was explaining, the belief, the credibility and reliability is something which depends upon the belief of the court on the given set of facts, to which it traces its power under section 3, and the existence of fact where the court will presume is covered under section 114 of the Evidence Act. So, insofar as there are three terms: proved, disproved, not proved. Insofar as proved is concerned, the court is very certain in its mind that the existence of a fact has been proved. Insofar as disproved is concerned, court is certain that the existence of the fact has not been proved. Insofar as not proved is concerned, it is neither here nor there. That is a case where there is a state of uncertainty, where a fact exists or does not exist is not very clear for the court. So the court will have an open mind insofar as this particular aspect is concerned. So, so I will now go back to the illustrated case. I was digressing from it for you to understand the provisions which deal with this power of the court to go into this process of believing existence of facts, etc. Now, let me go back. So what happens is that the illustrative case, again, remind that illustrative case. So what happens is that in the cross-examination, in the course of cross-examination, it is established that this so-called eyewitness who was examined on the side of the prosecution, he belongs to a different village altogether, and there was no way he could have been present in the scene of occurrence. At such a night time. The incident had taken place at 10:15 p.m. So this person belongs to a different village, and therefore he could not have seen this occurrence. So what happens? This person who is examined as an eyewitness, which was found to be relevant in the court, when the second test that is employed by the court finds that this person belongs to a different village and there was no rhyme or reason for this witness to have been present in the scene of occurrence, then the court says that this evidence is not credible, this is not reliable, and therefore his very presence in the scene of occurrence itself becomes a big doubt. Therefore, the court will apply this provision. No, I don't believe you. So the court will say it has been disproved. You understand? So therefore, this test starts coming. Then what happens? The sketch that is relied upon shows that there was no light in that place. The sketch did not show the existence of a lamppost there. There was no light in that case. It was not a full moon day, and it had the shady trees. It was virtually dark at that point of time. So what happens is that the very identity of the accused persons, namely C, D, and E, becomes a big question. If in such a dark night, the eyewitness could not have seen these persons at all, or the injured person could not have really identified them at all, then what happens is that their identity of the accused persons and the TI parade, which is relied upon as a relevant fact, again becomes questionable. Then the court has to necessarily go into the credibility or the reliability of this fact which has been admitted. Then what happens? One witness who talks about identifying the accused persons in the TI parade, in the course of cross-examination, he says that I was first taken to the police station, and in the police station I saw the C, D, and E sitting, and the police inspector told me that these are the three persons. Thereafter, the test identification parade happened. So what happened? The very relevant fact regarding the identity of the accused itself gets defeated. So the credibility or reliability of the relevant fact insofar as identifying the accused persons gets wiped off. Then what happens is the so-called recovery witnesses. In the course of cross-examination, it is established that they are stock witnesses for a number of cases like this, and police is regularly using them for this purpose, and therefore these persons could not have really been a witness for the confession or the recovery. Then even though it was a relevant fact and admissible, court doubts the very presence of the very confession and recovery in the presence of these witnesses. So the very recovery becomes a question. Even though it was a relevant fact, the recovery becomes a question because of the court not being able to really believe the witness, and the credibility and reliability becomes a question. Then there was I told you that there was a dying declaration with regard to the statement that was given by the deceased A to the doctor. In the course of cross-examination, it comes to be established that this person was not even in a conscious state of mind. Right from the time when he was taken in the van, he was completely unconscious, and he died in that state after 2 days. So therefore, there is no question of this person having given a statement to that effect to the doctor or anyone to be related. So therefore, even though it is sought to be relied upon as a dying declaration, which is a relevant fact, credibility becomes a problem. So therefore, the court will not be in a position to really rely upon it. So these are the various steps that takes place when it comes to this court assessing the credibility or reliability of a witness. So this is step number 2. Let's assume that the relevant fact has come in, it has been admitted, court is also convinced with the credibility and reliability. Then the third step that is involved in the process of appreciation of evidence is, for what purpose is this evidence going to be used? For what purpose it is going to be used? For what purpose is the evidence of the priest going to be used? It is for the purpose of establishing the confession made by the one of the accused person with regard to the incident without he being threatened or misrepresented, etc., etc. For what purpose are you relying upon the evidence of the postmortem doctor? For the purpose of assessing the nature of injury sustained and the cause of death. For what purpose are you relying upon the evidence of the injured witness? For the purpose of establishing the fact, the entire incident that took place where the injured person himself was attacked by the accused person. So, for what? So the third stage is, for what purpose are you going to use this evidence? This is the third stage of appreciation of evidence. And each evidence is relied upon to prove or disprove the fact. It is done to prove or so you will, the purpose for which it was done, then the court will assess whether this is to prove or disprove. It will both ways. So therefore, the purpose, for instance, if the accused person says that he was not even there in the country on the particular day and he was elsewhere and he claims alibi, then section 11 comes to his aid. He examines the witness to that extent. He marks air tickets, etc., etc. Then what happens? Then what happens is that this particular evidence is going to be used by one of the accused person in order to sustain his defense of alibi. So third is, for what purpose it is going to be used. Then the fourth step in the appreciation of evidence is that whether what is available before me is enough or it requires corroboration. Or some more evidence has to be collected, or it requires corroboration. So what happens is that the court will have to assess it based on what is before it. My dear friends, you please realize that section 134 of the Evidence Act talks only about the quality of a witness and not the quantity of the witness. So the numbers are not important. The reliability, the truthness of the witness is important. Even with the aid of just one evidence given by the injured witness, which is cogent, which is completely reliable, which is beyond any questions, the court can convict an accused person for the offense of murder. So therefore, it is not the number of persons involved, it is the quality of evidence that is before the court that becomes very important. So at this stage, the court has to assess whether with whatever fact is available before me by the witnesses, is it enough, or for the purpose of proving certain things, corroboration is required. Whether I have to take additional evidence whether additional evidence will be required. So therefore, this is the fourth step in which it happens. See, in Vadivel Devar case, the Honorable Supreme Court gave a sort of indication as to where it will be required. Honorable Supreme Court, and that Vadivel Devar case is the one which is relied upon till date. That is why I am relying upon it. It talks about witnesses, or it talks about three types of witnesses. One is fully believable, next is fully unbelievable, and next is partly believable, partly unbelievable. The Supreme Court said that it is in that third case where it is partly believable and partly unbelievable where corroboration is normally required. Where corroboration is normally required. That is what in Vadivel Devar it said. The last step that is taken in the appreciation of evidence is for the court to satisfy itself whether the fact has been proved. The fact has. So, after all these appreciations, after reliance and reliability, relevant fact admissibility, credibility, reliability of the evidence, then for what purpose I am using, then whether this is enough or after all this, if the court finds that it has been proved as stated in the section 3 about which I spoke in detail, then the court comes to a conclusion. Ultimately, the court comes to a conclusion. It is here that I want to read section 165 of the Evidence Act. Section 165 of the Evidence Act gives very, very wide powers to the court, with regard to everything in a trial, with regard to production of documents, with regard to examination of witnesses, etc., etc. I don't want to get into the scope of 165, except saying that this is the provision which gives the ultimate power to the court in the course of trial. Proviso is important. First proviso says, provided that the judgment must be based upon one, facts declared by this act to be relevant and duly proved. I'll again read that proviso. Provided that the judgment must be based upon facts declared by this act to be relevant. What was declared as relevant? Section 6 to section 55 was declared to be relevant. 1. 2. Whether those facts have been duly proved. So these are the two tests. It is only based on these two, it is only after fulfilling these two things, a judgment has to be given by the court is what 165 stipulates. So in the process of doing it, it starts from the admissibility and it ends with the proof of the same. And based on this, the court comes to a conclusion with regard to the case. This is how the scope of appreciation of evidence goes. See, the same process is adopted in a civil case also. The only difference is the standard of proof. Every word which I am saying has a lot of significance. The difference is the standard of proof. In a criminal case, the standard of proof is proving the case beyond reasonable doubts. In a civil case, it is preponderance of probabilities. Preponderance of probabilities. So therefore, this is the difference. The only difference is on the standard of proof. Or else, whatever I said for this particular illustrated case, I can give an illustrated case for a civil case also and explain, which I don't want to do now because of paucity of time. So, if you look at the illustrations, that are given under section 6, 8, 9, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, you will find that all these illustrations pertains to civil cases also. Don't be under the impression that it is only applicable for criminal cases. It also applies to civil cases. I only applied these provisions in a given criminal case which I illustrated, but these things equally apply to the civil case also, and that is abundantly clear from the illustrations that are given under these provisions. Then there are some very peculiar provisions which will apply more to the civil case, like under 32, starting from 32(2) onwards. Even 32(1) will apply to a civil case. So 32, 33, then 34 to 38, All these things are clearly applicable to civil cases also. And section 40 to 44, which deals with relevancy of judgments between the parties, it's applicable. Section 45 to 51, which talks of expert opinion, is applicable. Then the relevance of the character of parties, the character of the parties involved in litigation in a civil case and a criminal case is covered, which is covered under 52 to 55 of the Act, will apply to the civil and criminal cases. Meaning there are specific provision, two sections for the civil case, 2 sections for the criminal case. So character of the witnesses. So what is important is that you will have to get well acquainted with the Evidence Act and spend your initial years as a trial lawyer. My dear friends, my dear junior friends, I am pleading with you. I'm requesting you with folded hands that please start your career as a trial lawyer. It is very, very important. If you don't do it, and if you think that you will straight away come to the High Court or straight away go to the Supreme Court, then you are like a building without a good foundation. If you don't have a good foundation, your understanding the nuances of a civil or criminal case to that extent will be weak. And a judge who really knows the procedural side of it and the Evidence Act will easily be able to knock you down in the course of arguments. So therefore, you please get well acquainted with the Evidence Act and the procedural laws, and you lay a strong foundation as a trial lawyer. Please do trial work for some time. Please do trial work for some time. And a good trial lawyer is bound to succeed in this profession. There is no doubt about it at all. I do not have even the slightest of doubt. A good trial lawyer is bound to succeed. Do trial work. Do it patiently. See how the seniors are examining witnesses in the court. See how the art of cross-examination happens in a court. Look at how judges react to the demeanor of the witnesses in a case. All these things you will be able to learn only if you patiently observe it, and it takes time. Please do not try to earn money immediately after you get into the profession. Money is waiting for you and where it will start flowing at you after a particular period of time. What is important is not money immediately after you get into the profession. What is important is that you should be industrious. And this profession is meant only for people who are willing to put that hard work. Please understand that there is no shortcut method to come up in this profession. If you come that way, you will fall down very fast. People will be able to identify you. So therefore, thank you so much for this opportunity and my best wishes to all of you.
It's a great pleasure, Lordship, for this valuable time of yours. Today we have 2 things that I just wanted to inform the crowd before we started, but somehow it just escaped my mind. One issue is that today's lecture, maybe heard along with the last week's lecture. Last week, Lordship has given a lecture about examination of witnesses. I think for AKLC, that is again the starting of before the evidence is being presented. So how it is being done, the examination of it was again being dealt with in the last week, and that was again a very interesting lecture. And today's lecture may be had along with that. And secondly, today we had more participants from outside Tamil Nadu that I just wanted to highlight.
Okay.
So a lot of people outside Tamil Nadu have come, especially from Maharashtra and Telangana.
Oh, very happy, very good. So let this go on, and we will all try to equip ourselves as much as possible, probably before things comes to normalcy. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mr.
Anand, thank you very much.
I,
Anand poitara?
I believe he has left the forum. My lord.
Okay, okay. Thank you, thank you.
Thank you, my lord.
நல்லா ஆர்கனைஸ் பண்ணிருந்தீங்க. வெரி குட், வெரி குட்.
Thank you, my lord. Thank you.
பட் யாரெல்லாம் ஜூனியர்ஸ் இங்க இருக்காங்களோ உங்களுக்கு நான் ஜஸ்ட் ஒரே ஒரு அட்வைஸ் பண்ண விரும்புறேன். ஆனந்த் சொன்னபடி எங்க அப்பா எங்கிட்ட எப்பவுமே சொல்லுவாரு, யுவர் ஸ்டூடெண்ட் லைஃப் பிகின்ஸ் நவ் அப்படின்னு சொன்னாரு ஆன் தி டேட் ஆஃப் என்ரோல்மெண்ட். லாயர்ஸ் வந்து கொஞ்சம் அது கேர்ஃபுல்லா இருங்க. ரெண்டாவது அவர் சொன்ன மாதிரி இந்த வடிவேல ஜோக் சொன்ன மாதிரி பில்டிங் ஸ்ட்ராங் பேஸ்மெண்ட் வீக். அதனால ட்ரையல் ஒர்க் இஸ் எசென்ஷியல். ஆல் தி பெஸ்ட்.
Thank you, my lord. Thank you. Thanks a lot for your time. We would,
yes.
My lord, we would request your lordship also. I'm sorry to have put it on open forum, but
No problem. No. I'm also thinking of taking Industrial Disputes Act. I will let you know.
yes, my lord.
Because இந்த பேண்டமிக் சிச்சுவேஷனுக்கு அப்புறம் லாக்டவுன் லிஃப்ட் ஆனதுக்கு அப்புறம் கொஞ்சம் பிரச்சனை இருக்கும்னு நினைக்கிறேன். I'll take Industrial Disputes Act. I'll let you know.
Thank you, my lord. Okay. Those of you, I can send you the video of this the webinar. I'll just send you the link for that. Those of you want to get the link, I'll just give me a minute. I'll just just one second. Yeah, I'll just give the URL. You can kindly post, complete that URL, and we shall send the record version of it. Yeah, I'll also send the link for the examination of witness also. I thank all for participating, and I think we'll end the session.